I think we all recognize that probably every president in the last 50 years has talked about the need for a strategic energy policy. And the one that comes back to me probably most visible is Jimmy Carter as president. Coming out, it was during the Middle East oil crisis. You probably remember, some of you that are my age, remember the 6 o'clock news and the cars lined up down the block waiting to get gas. I talked to a state rep that was roughly my age the other day. She remembers going to, I think it was 4 or 5 different gas stations because she could only get 2 gallons at a time. And she had to get her car filled up. President Carter said we need to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And one way to do that is to reserve our natural gas for uses like home heating and industrial uses. And let's use coal as a resource for generating electricity. Because coal, the United States has, I think, the most coal reserves of any country in the world. And it is our single largest domestic supply of energy. So, because of that, the federal government actually directed utilities to build coal plants in the 1970s. Not exactly the same policy we're getting from the federal government today. But I want to point this out because a lot of people don't remember that. The federal government told us, directed us, they actually, for a few years, prevented us from using natural gas for generating electricity. And that's why you see, especially in the Midwest, a lot of coal-fired power plants. We didn't have access to the hydro that you have in the coastal regions, like Washington and Oregon. We didn't have as many nuclear plants built. We had access to a lot of coal in our region. And so we responded to the signals that was given to us. Coal was affordable, and it was a domestic resource. We didn't have to worry about foreign politics interrupting our flow. And the other nice thing about coal was we found that we could warehouse it on site. We could have, for example, 6 months supply if we needed to. One thing we did find out during January is there was a supply disruption in the natural gas line that caused some problems. There is no storage capability with natural gas. That's one of the challenges. The nice thing about natural gas is it has less emissions than coal. So there's always trade-offs between fuel choices. In the 70s, we also had the federal government advocating the development of nuclear energy. And they said, you know, we need to develop a federal location, the warehouse, to spent fuel for nuclear power plants. And Yucca Mountain was chosen. It was going to receive fuel in 1998. I think the last suggestion was we may have a repository by 2050. They have not been able to get a national repository. They have done a lot of work at Yucca Mountain, but frankly it got very political, and it's, for all intents and purposes, in spite of the billions they spent developing it, has now been effectively shut down. I don't know if they'll ever be able to restart it or not. As a result, the utilities end up having to warehouse the spent fuel until the federal government is able to fulfill its obligation. Now, because of those policies, use coal, use nuclear. It wasn't long, and we said, go ahead and use natural gas if you want. We ended up with a portfolio like this, where roughly half of the electricity in the country for decades was made from coal, natural gas about 20%, nuclear about 20%. That was sort of traditional for a number of decades. But in recent years, you know, and the first presentation was perfect setup for this, because there's been a lot of talk about global warming and the role that carbon dioxide is having on that. And because of that, the tide of public opinion has turned very negative towards coal, because coal has large amounts of CO2 emissions. For each megawatt generated, coal will release about twice as much CO2 as natural gas. So if as a policymaker you believe that CO2 emissions is a risk to our future, as a policymaker you're going to say, choose a fuel resource that produces less CO2. And so that's what we're seeing in the body politic. We're seeing all of energy policy being driven by the concerns about CO2. I hate to break this to you, but Congress hasn't been working very well together lately. As a result, frankly, energy policy is stalled at the congressional level, especially when you have Republicans controlling one body, the Democrats the other. There is no way they're going to find common ground. And so in the absence of their action, you've got the Environmental Protection Agency moving forward on the regulatory front. Okay? So it becomes a choice of, would you prefer to have Congress working on energy policy, the elected officials, or an agency that maybe has less ability to engage? EPA has proposed regulations in the last 5 to 10 years that basically impact every facet of coal generation. Solids, water emissions, air emissions, number of fronts. And as a result of that, I'll use Darrowland as an example again. Darrowland, on our two older plants, our two plants that were built in the late 70s, early 80s, we have just invested $324 million in air emission equipment. Now, as an analogy, think of the plant as a car and the air emissions equipment as the muffler, okay? We just spent a whole lot more on our muffler than we did on the car. We are spending more on emission equipment than we did on the original plant. But by doing that, we've reduced the emissions of nitrous oxides by 88%, sulfur dioxide we reduced by 95%. We'll capture 90% of the mercury emissions. Last I heard, I think we're capturing something like 99.8% of the particulates. In other words, these coal plants built in the 70s have never operated cleaner. It also means that these coal plants that maybe otherwise would be depreciated out now have a $324 million debt against them that our members will pay for over time. So the challenge is, well, getting at this. In 2007, EPA ruled that, or excuse me, the Supreme Court ruled that EPA does indeed have the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2. And so EPA has moved forward in crafting regulations to do just that. As a matter of fact, they just released, not too many months ago, rules on new coal-fired power plants. And the rules essentially say the only way you can build a new coal-fired power plant is if it can capture the carbon dioxide. The technology technically exists. It's not really viable on a large scale. And if you can make it work, at least the current technology is too expensive. The Congressional Budget Office even acknowledged that adding CCS to a power plant probably increases its cost by 60 to 70%, cost of operation. It probably doubles the cost of the plant, and it takes about a third of the energy of the plant to run the carbon capture. That's one challenge. The other challenge that I have is even if you can capture that carbon and inject it into the correct geology underground, you're talking about millions of tons of high pressure CO2. I don't think that will stand up environmentally. Because I think people will say, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt there'll be no negative impact of injecting that much CO2 underground. I don't think you can demonstrate that. So I just don't believe that carbon capture and sequestration is going to become a viable technology. What that means is, politically, you can't build a new power plant now. We can plan around that. Our bigger concern as an industry is what will be the rules on existing plants? Because you remember that slide? Historically, how much of our electricity has been coming from coal? Almost half. Now that has trended down in the last 5 years. I think we're down to about a third, or maybe slightly over. So there has been some conversion, but still, we're at 35 to 40% of our energy coming from coal. And so if the new rules make it difficult or impossible to operate existing plants, it's going to create a real transition challenge for us, because it's hard to replace a third to 40% of the electric supply in a short period of time. And so what this means is that the same federal government that in the 70s told us, build coal, is now pressuring us to shut them down. And the slide where I showed you, we just spent $350 million or $324 million on our plant. We've got debt against that and the plants have decades of remaining useful life if we can operate. And so the policymakers really going to have to wrestle with, if we want to transition away from coal, we need to partner in some way with the utilities so there's time to make the transition. And frankly, probably some time to utilize some of that existing useful life and pay off debt. That would be the least painful way of transitioning. The utility industry can transition if we just know what the rules are and where we're going to end up. As I mentioned, natural gas has lower emissions than coal, so a lot of utilities are switching in that direction. We've all heard about hydraulic fracturing and fracking. It's just revolutionized the natural gas and oil industry. Natural gas is very abundant, very affordable right now. And so as a result, utilities are switching to it. Nuclear. I thought a few years ago nuclear was on the verge of a kind of a renaissance. I thought it was going to come back. There was a lot of interest in new small modular facilities that literally could be built at a central location, brought out on flatbed trucks. You know, kind of technology maybe similar to what nuclear submarines have used. Smaller facilities, you could set them side by side if you wanted to get a large amount of electricity. In other words, if there were 50 megawatts each, you could put 5 of them side by side and have a 250 megawatt generation station. But then Fukushima happened. And frankly, it created a tremendous amount of concern again about the safety issues surrounding nuclear. And so I just don't think nuclear is going to take off in the near future. I think there's some possibilities in the future, but what would really help it is if the federal government could develop some kind of energy policy to take that spent fuel or reprocess it and reuse it again in facilities. Right now, frankly, building a new nuclear plant is a high-risk venture, both financial and from a regulatory standpoint. So this leads to the question, what does the future hold? Electricity has been, for the last 75 years, that's basically the length of most of the rural electric co-ops. Some of the investor-owns around before that, but really 75 years covers the bulk of electrification of the country. It's been ever larger central station power plants like this one. I'll be first to admit, new technology is challenging that model of large central station power plants supplying all of the need. And so the question is, can wind and solar replace those traditional fossil fuels? And nuclear. Wind turbines, we've all seen them dotting our landscape. You see small backyard units. I think at one time, my grandpa even had a small wind charger for that radio. I think he got a little bitty wind charger that stood outside in front of the house, big enough to recharge that battery. Obviously all the way to huge units like we have now. We're seeing a lot of interest in solar panels. in large part because the price of panels has dropped about 70% in the last 3 to 4 years. Tremendous drop in price. And because of that, there's been more interest. And solar is an example of distributed generation, where electricity is going to be generated at the point of use. Okay? And so what we see a lot of solar going in is individuals that want to put some on their own roof or in the backyard and offset some of their own energy usage. A lot of times they don't produce enough to meet all of their need, but we do have installations where they literally produce excess over their use and then sell some of that back to the utility. This is an example of the trend we've seen at Darrowland. Since 2007, we've had a 10-fold increase in privately owned distributed generation. So these would be facilities that people own for themselves. You can see that back in 2007, wind and solar were about equal in amounts. But in the last 3 years especially, the blue is the solar, has really taken off as the technology of interest. Prices are becoming more competitive. And the thing about solar is you don't have to climb 150 feet in the air to service it. There are no moving parts. And they're very scalable. You don't have to put up a huge unit for a small need. Now, I talked about solar quite a bit. Solar is described as a disruptive technology. And it said it has the potential to displace the traditional utility structure. Indeed, some people envision a future in which every home, every business will have their own solar panels, maybe a wind turbine. They'll generate enough electricity for their own needs. And you know, that vision is that you won't have a need for a large power plant. How are we doing at time? Okay, Brad, we need to speed it up. As you mentioned, I did serve in the legislature, so when I get a crowd gap, you're in trouble. But here's the thing. Cell phones are a disruptive technology, right? How many people, who in here does not have a cell phone or an iPad or something like that? Anyone in here? We got 1, 2, 3, 4.
I got an old-fashioned 1970-something rotary phone. And it still works.
It still works. But I raise that because cell phones are a disruptive technology. My kids don't even have a landline. Okay? And I suspect there's a fair number of you don't have a landline anymore. It's been completely replaced by this mobile device. Some people suggest that solar panels are the same. I would say there's a little difference. Do you need a landline for this to be functional? No. However, for the solar panels to be practical, they need to be able to interconnect with the grid. Because what was one of the problems with solar panels? You don't use a lot of electricity at night, but you use some, and solar doesn't generate at night. So if you're a consumer that has a solar panel, you want to still be connected to the grid. So when the sun is shining, you can offset your load, but when the sun isn't shining, you've got your utility still taking care of your load, because you want to be able to turn the light on any time of the day. So that's why I think there's a difference between renewable technologies and, for example, the cell phones. Because at least with today's technology, now maybe this will change, but with today's technology, renewables on their own just can't provide that 24/7 reliability or constant availability, I should say, that traditional generation can. So we've got federal and state governments that are actively debating energy policy. And here's one of the key things. I think that if policymakers want wind and solar and renewables to succeed, they've got to recognize that the success of those depends upon the continued success of that traditional system that it has to interconnect to. And indeed, we want to do that in a way, in other words, we want new policies that allow for the integration of these new technologies, but done in a way that doesn't undermine or strand 75 years of investments. We've got $324 million we just invested in 2 coal plants. To me, it makes sense to find a way to integrate those technologies in a time frame that utilizes the new and the existing. Now, I'm going to try and wrap this up, because we're kind of getting to the crux now of the energy policy challenges. We've got a variety of technologies, and what appears to be the direction we're going is adding thousands, maybe millions, of small intermittent generators. Solar panels, wind turbines, maybe there's new technologies coming. Okay, adding thousands of nodes of generation input into the grid. The utilities, part of the utilities' role is, again, to make sure that generation and load are what? Balanced at all times of the day. The more generation inputs you have, the greater the complexity of balancing the two. Also, distribution lines were designed to flow electrons in one direction, from the generator to your home. You put a solar panel on your roof, and there'll be times when your solar panel may be making more energy than you use, therefore it's going to now inject some of those electrons back toward the utility. It's like putting a car into a one-way street. It can create conflict until you get the rules worked out. Maybe turn that into a two-way street now. Those distribution lines were originally designed as one-way streets. So these are all, what should I say, engineering challenges that we have to accommodate. The utility role is going to be more challenging. The 2 most foundation resources are becoming politically unpalatable. You can't build new coal. New nuclear is very difficult to build. I think there are 3 in the country being built. I'll be interested to see if they get it done and on budget, because it's very, very difficult. Natural gas plants are being planned and built. Here's the challenge. I think they're going to get built faster than we've got infrastructure to serve them. We're going to need to add natural gas pipelines. As I mentioned, in January of this year, we already had natural gas supply disruptions during the cold weather, when the demand was exceeding the supply. And of course, intermittent renewables is going to add a new level of complexity. So these are the challenges that utilities are going to wrestle with. Here's kind of some summary. Affordable and reliable electricity is really the bedrock on which our economy has been built for the last 50 to 75 years. As we transition away from coal and nuclear, traditional baseload generation, electric rates are going to go higher. I just don't see any way around that. And we're going to need some new technologies. Especially if we transition away from baseload plants that are running 24 hours a day, we're going to need technologies like affordable battery storage or something, so that you can generate excess energy during the day when the wind is blowing and draw it back when the sun is not shining or the wind has declined. So we're going to need to integrate new technologies. And so here's the conclusion. Is America's energy policy becoming visionary, or is it becoming more vulnerable? Here's my answer. It's becoming more challenging. Only time will tell. Will we be able to, from an engineering standpoint, integrate all of these new challenges? As a utility, you like things the way they are, or the way they have been, because we comfortable. I have to acknowledge, there is a limited amount of fossil fuel in the world that's available. Now, we've got a lot available at the moment, but some of this discomfort helping us transition to renewables, maybe there's a role for that. So with that, thank you for your effort.